Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Millicent Walker, standing in for Shola Shoyele, who's on holiday. On this episode of Law Weekly, we begin with a report on the People's Tribunal for Murder of Journalists, which opens at The Hague. 3 advocacy groups come together with the aim of raising awareness of crimes against journalists. I also speak to the Director of Policy and Programmes, Free Press Unlimited, and the founder of A Safer World for the Truth, Leon Williams. Next, you'll see my interview with senior lawyer and partner Olaniwo Ajayi, Dr. Khrushchev Ekweme, on the judiciary and its independence, among the other tiers of government. Journalists around the world are frequently detained, kidnapped and even killed for simply reporting the news. In the past 30 years, at least 1,400 journalists have been killed, yet most of those responsible for their deaths have faced no accountability. This next report tells us more. United Nations data collected in 2021 on threats of violence and crimes against journalists shows the impunity rate is continuing at 87%. That represents a high rate to previous years. Out of 139 journalists killed between 2011 and 2020 in the 4 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean with the highest numbers of killings, 41% of them had received threats prior to the assassination. The majority of journalists are killed in their country of nationality. Among the 400 journalists killed from 2016 to 2020, 22, that's about 6%, were foreigners.
My mother was murdered in October 2017. What happened in the interim?
Matthew Caruana Galizia, son of assassinated journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, speaking about the struggles for justice in the aftermath of his mother's death at the People's Tribunal at The Hague. An assessment by A Safer World for the Truth initiative says that in 8 out of 10 cases, the killers are set to go free, emphasizing that killing the truth appears to be the world's safest crime.
Welcome, everyone.
Hoping to put an end to this, Free Press Unlimited, Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders are joining forces to investigate, to document, to pursue justice and create a safer world for the truth.
A safer world for the truth is needed to seek justice, to prove cold cases can be investigated, to find new evidence and push judicial authorities to reopen these cases and bring justice for the sake of the truth.
In 2019, there were no perpetrators successfully prosecuted in 86% of the cases. Journalists all around the world are harassed, arrested, kidnapped and murdered for doing their job, for finding the truth, something the People's Tribunal hopes to stop.
There are numbers given by Baroness and others that at least 8 out of 10 cases are in complete impunity, which means, and that has been determined across borders, that no cases have been heard, not investigations opened, but also where there is no access for victims to opening those cases, and there are no judges actively listening during these sessions.
It's also a situation some journalists in Africa, including Nigeria, continue to face. In August 2019, Daddy Yatta, a critic of the government, went missing, with reports claiming that he was abducted by armed men while driving into his residence in Kaduna. A report from the Nigeria Union of Journalists on Press Freedom documents at least 300 violations affecting about 500 journalists, media workers and media houses in the country from 2016 to 2020. The increasing rate of violations of media professionals and members of their families is a clear signal that journalists are now being deliberately targeted as a result of the work they do.
Unfortunately has limited capacity to include more cases. But in this opening hearing, we've aimed to include as many stories as possible from all over the world. So one of the important expert testimonies in the opening hearing came from the regional director for West Africa for Article 19, Fatou Jagne Senghor, who spoke on deteriorating press freedom, particularly in West Africa, and the role that emblematic cases of murders of journalists.
The People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists is looking to indict the governments of Sri Lanka, Mexico and Syria for failing to deliver justice for the murders of La Santa Rikamatunge, Miguel Angel Lopez Velasco and Nabil Al-Shabaji. In my interview with the Director of Policy and Programs, Free Press Unlimited, and founder of A Safer World for the Truth, Leon Williams, I began by asking if it is getting more and more difficult to be a journalist in this century.
I think across the world we're seeing an increase of threats to journalists. We see more harassment of journalists. We see more online threats made to journalists, and recent research is showing that online threats eventually turn out into physical abuse, attacks, and unfortunately also after a few years of less journalist murders, we see in recent years that number is increasing. So yes, I would say across the world there's a pattern of increased risk for journalists.
In terms of the statistics, what is this saying about the death, the killing, the kidnapping and the abuse of journalists around the world?
Just to give you an idea about the increase in cases, Free Press Unlimited runs a reporter safety fund where journalists from around the world can ask for support. In 2018, we had about 150 requests. In 2019, we had 300 requests. In 2020, we have 700 requests. I don't think that is because Free Press Unlimited has suddenly become a world-known brand. It is basically because the amount of threats, the harassment, photographers whose camera has been taken, kidnappings, legal prosecution because of new laws that make the work of journalists impossible or that make critique impossible is on the rise. And so that's just one statistic. Last year, according to RSF, 64 journalists were killed. The year before it was 50. This year we see the enormous threat to journalists in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, in Sudan. Several journalists have been arrested for covering the current protest that is going on against the military coup. So you could say that there's a lot of incident-related, public demonstrations-related, temporary arrests, etc., that are happening, including very grave human rights violations, like in Belarus and in Afghanistan, for example. A lot of journalists have been killed this year. So yes, we are concerned with the rising numbers in many ways.
Why this initiative of the People's Tribunal?
Well, one of the most important things that we think is missing in the entire protection and prevention of crimes against journalists is prosecution. We see since 1992, 1,400 journalists have been murdered around the world. These 1,400 journalists had 1,400 media houses where they belonged to, 1,400 families, and they were working on more than 1,400 stories that were killed with them. So this is one of the grave issues that we see, because there's no prosecution of the ones that order these murders or the ones that have enacted these murders. In more than 80% of the cases, there's no prosecution. So the murder of a journalist is really a cost-free exercise on behalf of states or criminal gangs or the ones that want to silence journalists. And we think that if we don't solve the prosecution issue, if we don't get punishment for killing a journalist, we can protect as many journalists around the world, but then the numbers will increase because it's basically for free.
At the hearing that I listened in on, and in one of the testimonies, someone said that social media has become a megaphone for the tyrants. Do you agree? And would you say that it has caused more harm than good?
Well, most indications show that some of these social media platforms are doing an exceptionally bad job if it comes to preventing hate speech and threats to journalists. And recent research that was executed by the Oxford Institute shows that, for example, in the case of women journalists, online threats transform into online threats. In more than 20% of the cases, online threats result in physical violence against women journalists. So if you extrapolate that with the amount of hate speech that is happening across the world, where journalists are being blamed for everything that is wrong, and you see the important role that government actors play in cursing journalists for their work, in basically criticizing journalists for their work, in basically saying journalists are responsible for fake news, then we believe that state actors, political actors, have a hugely important role in the rising number of threats that are made to journalists, which eventually transform into physical harm. So yes, we think social media are a megaphone, and we see also that social media companies are not taking any responsibility for it. So that is a serious problem. And at the moment, I would agree, certainly in the case of harm to journalists, that social media platforms play a bad role, more bad than worse.
I'd like to thank you so much, Leon Williams, Director of Policy Programs, Free Press Unlimited. Thank you so much for taking out time to talk on this very important issue, an end to impunity for crimes against journalists. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for asking me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Up next is a report by the Nigerian Bar Association calling for the immediate treatment of persons with gunshot wounds, as stated in the Gunshot Injury Act 2017. Concerned by the slow implementation of the Compulsory Treatment and Care for Victims of Gunshot Injury Act, which was signed into law by President Muhammadu Buhari in 2017, the Nigerian Bar Association convened this meeting.
Put your hands together for Chief Michael Zekeme.
The NBA reveals that the act is yet to yield its full benefits to Nigerians, as there are widely reported cases of victims of gunshot injuries being denied treatment by hospitals and clinics on grounds of fear of arrest by officers of the Nigerian police force.
Do we use mere advocacy? Do we go confrontational by going to court to seek an order of mandamus compelling medical doctors to treat victims and to compel members of the Nigerian police force not to harass such medical doctors or medical personnel for treating such victims?
When citizens get shot or have gunshot injuries and are taken to the police, they are taken to the hospitals or treatment centers, that most persons lose their life due to the fact that the hospitals insist on police report.
While the police insist that victims of gunshot wounds should be given proper treatment, they want all cases of gunshot injuries reported.
We have never stopped them and will never oppose them treating victims of gunshot wounds. What we've always asked is, when you commence the treatment, please reach out to us. Once you commence a treatment and you suspect that this is a gunshot wound or a gunshot injury, please reach out to us.
The NBA, as a public interest organization, has set up a 25-man team, which includes stakeholders across the security agencies and the association. The idea is that the committee will consider areas of concern by stakeholders for the purpose of drawing up a national framework for the effective implementation of the Act. In this next interview, my guest says that the judiciary continues to be under attack from law enforcement agencies. He believes that even though the judiciary can protect itself, the other arms of government, the executive, should be able to protect judicial officers.
In Nigeria, in terms of the constitutional framework, we got it right. But unfortunately, in terms of the implementation on the ground, you see sometimes executive lawlessness, especially during the military, administration, and then some, pockets of executive lawlessness in democratic governments.
Is the judge above the law?
Well, the starting point is to note that as a general principles, judges have, restricted immunity. The immunity the judges have is limited in scope. For instance, the normative content of that immunity is that the judges are immune, from legal proceedings in relation to the discharge of their judicial duties. Now, that does not mean that the judge is above the law, and that does not mean, again, that the judge cannot be charged to court. But there is what I will call the case law of the country as represented by the case of Ganjiwa and FIRN, that stands for the proposition that you have to first remove the judicial toga of a judge before you can subject the judge to criminal proceedings. So if there is a suspicion that a judge has committed an offense before a charge or an information is filed against a judge, that judge has to be first reported to the agency if the facts constituting the count or the offense relates to what is required for the judge to be a judge. That is, if it touches on the honesty and integrity of the judge. So if it has to do with bribery, corruption, stealing, those are the things that touch on the integrity of the judge. But if it's about reckless driving, I do not think that you need the interposition of the NJC process.
In terms of the activity of the executive, legislature, and also the judiciary, do you see what has happened in the last couple of weeks, that incident, affecting negatively our democracy?
Oh, yes. I think that it's not a good thing for your democracy. Because at the heart of a democratic government is the principle of rule of law. And one of the key components of rule of law is the independence of the judiciary. And independence of the judiciary, if you want to unpack it, it's about insulation of the judiciary from control and manipulation and intimidation from other arms of government. So it's a bad day for, that day was a bad day for our democracy. And the only way we can redeem ourselves is to openly, name and shame the people responsible and then bring them to justice.
It's the culture of the judiciary to be quiet, silent, but it appears that cloak has been taken off with the statement by the Supreme Court following the situation, the siege at Justice Orderly's home.
Well, I think we need to preserve the tradition around the bench, and that integrity, that we build around the bench, that we inherited, and allow the lawyers to be more vocal. I would say that we need to be more forceful. We need to defend the public, defend our courts, because an independent judiciary is of critical importance to good governance and also to the building of an egalitarian society. And traditionally, judges do not speak for themselves. They don't fight for themselves, except when they make orders. So The only thing I expect is good that the Supreme Court has spoken, and I know that when the Supreme Court speaks, it sends a message, to subordinate courts, So, and at the appropriate time, the appropriate measures will be taken.
And here's what happened in the courtrooms this week.
We begin in the Lagos High Court, TBS, where a witness in the murder trial of Chidinma Ojukwu, the 23-year-old accused of killing the chief executive officer of Super TV, Usifo Ataga, gave her testimony. The witness, Nkechi Mogwo, is the owner of the short-let apartment at 19 Adewale Oshin Street, Lekki Phase 1, where Mr. Usifo was murdered. As she was sworn on oath, presented by Olayinka Adeyemi, the Director of Public Prosecution, to assist in the murder trial. In her testimony, Mogwo said on June the 13th she got a phone call from a lady who said she saw her apartment online and inquired as to whether they had the necessary facilities. She said the lady identified herself with the name Jewel and said she will take the apartment for 3 days. After payment, she was handed the key to the apartment. She told the court that she provided all the chats between them and sent same to the police by email and also printed a copy while in custody. When she was asked to tender the WhatsApp records as evidence in the matter, lawyers to the defendants objected. But in her ruling, the judge, Yetunde Adesanya, overruled the objection, admitted the documents as exhibits, E1, and adjourned the matter to November 15th for further hearing. Meanwhile, in another courtroom at the Lagos High Court, sitting at Tafawa Balewa Square, the trial of a Danish national, Peter Nielsen, accused of killing his Nigerian wife Zainab and his 3-year-old daughter Petra, resumed. According to Nielsen, he woke up around 7:30 a.m. and noticed that his wife was not in the bedroom, so he went to look for her. He said he found his wife lying lifeless with their daughter on the kitchen floor. Nielsen said there was a strong smell of gas when he opened the kitchen door. The witness said he tried to resuscitate his wife and daughter, but when he realized that they were dead, he called his wife's stepfather and told him and his wife to come to Lagos. However, while the witness was trying to narrate about the wife's stepfather, the prosecution, led by the Commissioner for Justice, Lagos State, Mr. Amoyoshore Onigbanjo, objected to the evidence. He said it was hearsay evidence and hence should not be admitted in evidence. The defendant's counsel maintained that the court should allow the evidence. After the counsel arguments, Justice Bolanle Okikolu Ihile adjourned for ruling and continuation of hearing until November 23rd. In another case, a Lagos High Court in Ikoyi has ordered all commercial banks to furnish it with comprehensive statements of the accounts of Imagine Global Holding Company Limited, Imagine Global Solutions Limited, and a couple, Bamishi and Elizabeth Ajetumobi, within 7 days. Justice Oyeko Abdullahi made the order sequel to a motion filed and argued by the plaintiff's counsel, Adetunji Adedoyin Adeniyi of AAA Chambers. According to the plaintiff's motion, the 11.795 billion naira is the outstanding investments and return on investments accruing to them from the defendants. Adeniji, in urging the court to grant the application, argued that the reports the banks had already provided were faulty and could not be relied on. He prayed for an order compelling the banks to furnish the court and serve the claimant's counsel and Central Bank of Nigeria not later than 7 days from the date of receipt of the order of the court. The two firms said the Ajetumobi couple have been associated with an 11.795 billion naira investment scam by the claimant's applicants, who are aggrieved Nigerian investors. And to the Federal High Court in the nation's capital, where the trial of the leader of the proscribed indigenous people of Biafra, Nnamdi Kanu, has been adjourned to January 19, 2022. This came as lawyers to Mr. Kanu protested alleged refusal by the DSS to allow them access into the courtroom, where the trial judge, Justice Binta Yako, was to hear the application, challenging the jurisdiction of the court and the competency of the charge. In a short ruling, Justice Yako declined to dismiss the pending application as demanded by Mr. Kanu's lawyers and adjourned the case till January.
That's our program for now. Until next time, don't forget that you can catch this episode of the program and past episodes on our YouTube channel. I'm Millicent Walker. Thank you for watching. Stay safe.